As I get older, I often find myself trying to reconcile why some games resonate with me so much more and others so much less than I expect or hope for. I found that over the years, my confidence in what I will and won't like before I actually spend time with the game is nearly non-existent. I'm constantly finding games I've looked forward to and which deliver on many of, if not all, the promises made by their developers to be deeply unfulfilling experiences. And on the flip side, I've also found that there are many games I would have discounted as simply not being for me or not to my tastes, which have given me some of the best experiences I've had in my 20 plus years of gaming. It's these opposing experiences that have made me universally more open to meeting each and every game on its own terms and inspired me to share my passion for games with others through long-form commentary and critiques of the games I play. All that is to say, Tears of the Kingdom is a game that I feel truly conflicted about, because it neither left me deeply disappointed, nor left a lasting impression on me, and yet I've mostly heard it spoken of in extreme hyperbole, as though it's either a once-in-a-generation masterpiece or a legendarily crushing disappointment. One of the reasons I've chosen to add my thoughts to the discussion is because I'm legitimately perplexed by the conviction people have for this game, both extremely positive and extremely negative, when it's so clearly a game of both great highs and great lows that falls somewhere in the middle. I went into Tears of the Kingdom with modest expectations, having not been particularly impressed by Breath of the Wild nor its predecessors. Simply put, I have somewhat lukewarm feelings towards the franchise. But like its predecessors, Tears of the Kingdom was one of many games I chose to play mostly because my ambitions as an aspiring video game critic compel me to experience and develop a meaningful understanding of as many games as possible. Well, that, and because I was curious to see what Nintendo had done to the Breath of the Wild formula with 6 years of development time to refine and iterate on it. I played Tears of the Kingdom with the explicit goal of gathering and publishing my thoughts on it, regardless of how I felt about the game by the end. Those thoughts make up the bulk of what I have to say about it here in today's video. Before we get to that, and the many spoilers therein, I'd like to give a spoiler-free mini-review of Tears of the Kingdom for anyone still on the fence or waiting to play it themselves. As I said above, Tears of the Kingdom is a game that left me feeling very conflicted in many ways. On one hand, it's a truly incredible experience that improved on its predecessor in almost every way and left me stunned by the scale and beauty of its world. But on the other hand, it's home to a confused mess of systems and design choices that constantly feel at odds with one another, and made me equal parts exasperated and disappointed throughout my playthrough. Over the course of my roughly 100 hours with the game, I experienced some of the most engaging, curiosity-fueled exploration I've ever had in an open world, saw incredible sights, played with incredible traversal tools, and engaged with the environment around me like few games have ever managed to make me do. But I also suffered through combat and puzzles that consistently failed to engage me whenever I wasn't going out of my way to make them interesting or challenging. I never once faced a combat encounter or puzzle that demanded anything more than the most basic problem-solving abilities. And to round out this incredibly uneven experience, I was presented with what might have been a decent story, delivered in a manner so ill-considered that I basically had any chance to enjoy it stolen from me by the game itself. However, in spite of all that, my first 40 or so hours with the game were easily a 9 out of 10. At every turn it felt as though I was seeing the early indications of substantial improvements to Breath of the Wild's biggest issues, and any cynicism I had coming off of its predecessor was largely being eroded by just how much fun I was having. The early stages of the game in the first couple dozen hours were truly incredible, and I don't begrudge any reviewer, critic, or fan who finished the game in under 50 hours and felt it was a masterpiece. However, after having spent twice that long with Tears of the Kingdom and only completing what I estimate to be roughly half of the game's total content, not including Koroks, I couldn't disagree more. Past the 50-hour mark, it started to become more and more clear that the improvements I was impressed by early on had only one layer of surprise, and that I'd seen pretty much all there was worth seeing. The more I played, the more glaringly obvious it became that Nintendo had consistently wasted resources on making small improvements to systems which ultimately should have been redesigned or removed. I've personally come to the conclusion that the incredible introduction, fun new abilities, and first couple dozen hours are so good that they give most people the momentum necessary to glide through the game at a reasonable pace towards a satisfying end. I believe this amazing early game experience masks a lot of the fundamental design flaws that only start to rear their heads once the player chooses to thoroughly explore and develop a deeper familiarity with the game. And that's not to say there aren't other obvious problems that I experienced even when the game was at its best, but for a time it flew so high that anything worth disparaging seems small and distant back on the ground. I'm reluctant to give review scores because I think they are and always have been massively inflated, and I'm not sure I even believe they have a place in proper critique. But with that said, I know a lot of people would prefer I give a score just as a point of reference for content I make in the future. So if I had to choose a grading system, I would go with the basic 10-point scale, but unlike mainstream gaming outlets, I'd like to make use of the entire scale. A 1 or 2 is explicitly for soulless shovelware and or mobile games or games that are broken to the point of being unplayable, such as Cyberpunk 2077 on last-gen consoles or Fallout 76 at launch. 3s and 4s would go to bland, uninspired, or otherwise mediocre games that do at least work in spite of how shallow or disappointing they may be. This is where I'd put most yearly sports games and games like No Man's Sky back on its launch, but not today, it's much better now. As an aside, this is also what I would score good and or great games plagued by monetization, such as Diablo 4. 5 and 6 would be for games that are mid or decent, but unambitious or otherwise good and great games plagued with technical problems that bring down the overall experience. Examples of the former being the modern Assassin's Creed games or Jedi Fallen Order, and an example of the latter being a game like Dishonored 2. I love Dishonored 2, but it ran terribly at launch and is poorly optimized to this day. 7 and 8 would be the realm of the good and great games that either do something new and innovative to great effect, like Breath of the Wild with its combination of open world design and intuitive interaction, or successfully iterate on and substantially refine that which came before, such as what Final Fantasy XVI did recently for cinematic action-adventure games. 9 and 10 are reserved for the pinnacles of gaming, the games that come around maybe a handful of times a generation and often bring to life or reinvent entire genres. They don't have to be perfect or completely free from any and all technical problems because that's simply not reasonable to ask of the games with the ambition to earn these scores. These are the games which prove unequivocally that games are the highest form of art we've yet achieved and bring something new, special, or otherwise revolutionary to gaming as a whole. Games like The Outer Wilds, Dark Souls, Mass Effect, and Final Fantasy VII, just to name a few. Now, having outlined a scoring system that I think somewhat accurately reflects how I evaluate games, I'm personally tempted to give Tears of the Kingdom a 6 because I don't find the technical state of the game to be acceptable. However, it also didn't dramatically impact my enjoyment in spite of that, so I feel comfortable giving it a 7. Despite how that might sound, I'm not trying to be a contrarian or shit on anyone's favorite games. I loved a lot of my time playing through Tears of the Kingdom, and I think it speaks volumes about what's wrong with gaming journalism and consumers alike that many people will view giving it a 7 as controversial or rage-baiting. That aside, I question how anyone not under a strict deadline to publish in time for release could ever review this game and either look past its very obvious flaws, or come to the conclusion that its achievements outweigh those flaws. All in all, I found Tears of the Kingdom to be a good, if not great game, with the potential for countless hours of entertainment if you're the type of player that strongly resonates with building and crafting your own solutions to problems. That is, unless you want the problems to demand any level of skill or creativity from the process of solving them. If you can look past the complete lack of challenge and create your own fun for long enough to appreciate the joy of exploration and the beauty of its world, I'd gladly recommend Tears of the Kingdom for that alone. But if you need to be presented with a meaningful challenge to derive satisfaction from combat or puzzles, or expect a grand adventure that tests your resolve, you certainly won't find it here. And that's my mini review for anyone still on the fence about playing Tears of the Kingdom. If you're trying to avoid spoilers or haven't played the game and still plan to, I highly recommend doing so before watching past this part of the video. I will be taking a thorough look at my playthrough, including spoilers for both Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. Many of the more interesting discoveries to be made in the open world and solutions to a number of shrines and puzzles will be shown as well, and a great deal of what is special in Tears of the Kingdom can be ruined with too much information. I went into it completely blind for the best possible experience, and I believe you should too. With that out of the way, let's get on with the video. Before I get into Tears of the Kingdom, I also think it's important you know where I stand on Breath of the Wild and the expectations I had going into its sequel. As I mentioned earlier, I found Breath of the Wild to be a fairly mediocre game both back when it was released and in the short playthrough I finished the night before Tears of the Kingdom's own release. However, much like Tears of the Kingdom, I have enough respect for what it does well and the ways in which it innovated to look past the ways it disappointed me personally. When I first played it, I honestly wasn't open enough to playing it the right way and pretty quickly bounced off of it. Yes, there are right and wrong ways to play a game, but that's a discussion and video for another time. I found the combat boring, the shrines equally so, and when I finished my first Divine Beast, I set the game down and didn't look back. Over the years, I watched videos from critics and other content creators that helped contextualize what the game did so well and why I hadn't been able to see that before. However, even with that realization, many of my other complaints were validated by the same people, and again when I finished my most recent playthrough on Master Mode. The combat is simply broken and poses no meaningful challenge, unless you count the choice to run away early on in Master Mode when assessing whether or not you have enough weapons with enough damage to clear the early game enemies. The biggest contributors to this are the health system and Flurry Rush. The former basically made death an impossibility except in Master Mode where attacks could one-shot you, but in the base game you could survive any attack so long as you kept your hearts topped off. That paired with the pause to heal system made dying almost exclusively a result of laziness or not having enough supplies on hand, which in itself requires going out of your way to ignore the abundance of healing ingredients all around you. Flurry Rush simplified combat to a silly degree because it could be repeatedly and consistently activated by dodging attacks that were never going to hit Link in the first place. Any skilled player would be able to identify and abuse this easily, and sometimes even by accident. All that aside, I recognize that I missed the chance to have the more meaningful, exploration-driven experience many others did their first time with the game, and so unfortunately, I've experienced more of the bad than good, which heavily skews my perspective towards the unfavorable with Breath of the Wild. But because of all that, I was more excited and hopeful to finally have a positive exploration-driven experience in Tears of the Kingdom with the fresh and unexplored Hyrule. While I didn't expect to be surprised in any substantial way, I avoided any and all information about Tears of the Kingdom other than the vague mention of the crafting system, and was looking forward to the game despite my aforementioned skepticism. As I already alluded to in the opening, I was wrong about not being surprised. Tears of the Kingdom did blow me away in many regards, both for better and for worse. And on that note, we're finally ready to dive into Tears of the Kingdom itself. The next section is an abridged recap of my playthrough from the beginning of the game to the end of my first temple/dungeon. The timestamp on screen and in the description is there if you're already familiar with the game or just want to skip to the critique. Let's get on with the video. Tears of the Kingdom, like its predecessor, begins immediately upon first starting the game, but this time there's a short prologue sequence as Link and Zelda explore the catacombs beneath Hyrule Castle. There are a couple cutscenes separated by short walking segments before the two proceed deeper into darkness and a final cutscene begins. During said scene, the Master Sword is shattered by an ominous figure who seemingly corrupts Link's arm before raising Hyrule Castle from the ground. The scene continues until Link reaches out for Zelda and watches her fall away into darkness as a strange arm catches him and the screen fades to black. He awakens to the sound of an unfamiliar voice in his head who apparently healed his wounds and replaced his arm with a strange new one to prevent it from getting worse. As the cutscene ends, we're given control of Link and our attention is drawn to the broken Master Sword. From here, we pick up the sword, cut through some vines, and interact with a strange device using our new arm. It's just a short trip through the rest of the cave before we're outside and prompted to dive off the nearby cliff. This leads into a short cinematic reveal of the floating islands and the title drop, as we skydive down to a pond and splash into the water in an admittedly impressive little intro. Not gonna lie, this scene was beautiful, and I was surprised by how strong the art direction and choice of colors were right out the gate. Having mentioned the visuals, I'm sure some people are curious about performance, but don't worry, we'll get to that later. Anyway, as Link steps out of the water and onto dry land, it's revealed that we're on the Great Sky Island. Having just finished Breath of the Wild the night before, I immediately recognized this as being our new Great Plateau and set my expectations accordingly. In doing so, I assumed that upon leaving this island, we would have most of the tools we needed to explore the open world and be given our primary objective. That seemed to be the case as I pressed forward. I scouted out the small island I was on and had my first encounter with a new enemy type, the Zonai Constructs. We'll be seeing a lot more of these, and they're sort of a stand-in or replacement for the smaller Guardian-type enemies from Breath of the Wild. During combat with this first construct, I was hopeful the Master Sword wouldn't. Okay, let's back up for just a second, as this was my only serious disappointment in the first 10 or so hours. For starters, I had only one serious issue with the durability system in Breath of the Wild. The fact that without even a 1 damage unbreakable weapon or the ability to punch enemies, situations like this one from Joseph Anderson's 2017 Breath of the Wild critique are entirely possible for anyone to end up in.
Even though I could beat this monster, Link could not, or more specifically, his weapons couldn't. I was incapable of dealing enough damage with them before they broke and I was out of options. It wasn't that I couldn't dodge him for long enough or anything like that, it's that I was literally incapable of killing this monster without better gear. This turned me off the combat for dozens of hours after this. I'm not kidding either, I dismissed so much of it as a gear-based game that was all about acquiring armor and weapons and more hearts. My response to this may seem extreme, but I hate it when games mix gear progression and skill together without making it so players can still skill their way through if they play well enough.
Not to lay on the foreshadowing too thick, but to my surprise and amazement, I managed to make an almost identical mistake in Tears of the Kingdom later on that could have been avoided with the exact same solution to weapon durability Joseph suggests later in the same video.
My favorite idea that could also improve the story is that Link starts with a broken Master Sword. When he fought Ganon in the past, he got trashed so bad that the sword was shattered. When he was left in the Resurrection Shrine, all he has is a hilt with a jagged blade. This could be Link's permanent weak weapon that you could upgrade by questing for lost shards throughout the world.
I personally love this idea, but never imagined it would make its way into the sequel. So when this happened, I started to get my hopes up. And then when this happened, I thought, no way, did they actually do it? And when immediately after we did this, I was almost convinced that they had actually taken this simple but effective step towards fixing the problem. But unfortunately not. Sorry for that tangent, but this was one of the only moments in my first few days with the game that really let me down. On the bright side, my disappointment was, at least in that moment, short-lived, and I pushed on still enjoying the vivid autumn colors of the Great Sky Island. After thoroughly exploring this first little area, I went on and activated a strange statue that turned out to be an NPC called a Steward Construct, and was given this game's version of the Sheikah Slate, the Pura Pad. If, like myself, you're wondering what happened to the Sheikah Slate, don't worry, as I'll no doubt have to say many times throughout the video, we'll get to that later. But the short version is,
you can't handle the truth!
After being given the magic switch, we're told to go to the temple marked on the map and head off to do exactly that while thoroughly exploring along the way. Only an hour in, and having just reached the Temple of Time, I was definitely taking things slow and enjoying the sights while fighting through some more Zonai constructs. Upon arriving at the Temple of Time, we are greeted by the ghost of Rauru, the first king of Hyrule. Anyway, our furry Super Saiyan here claims to be the previous owner of our strange new arm, and subsequently instructs us to visit our first shrine. Doing so unlocks our first power, Ultra Hand, which allows us to move most objects in the game in a manner similar to magnesis and attach them to one another for building a nearly infinite number of tools, vehicles, and other contraptions. Upon completing the shrine, we are given a Light of Blessing that is just a reskin of a Spirit Orb from Breath of the Wild. Following this, Rauru sends us to 2 more shrines which upon completion will reward us with 2 more powers and subsequently 2 more Lights of Blessing. The first of these shrines by proximity, and the first one I went to unlock, was Fuse, the power to combine our shields, weapons, and arrows with just about any object, monster part, or other weapon. We'll go over the powers later, but for now I just want to point out that it is the combination of Ultra Hand and Fuse which make up the bulk of unique interactions in the game, and are the foundation of all crafting, quote-unquote, aside from cooking. These 2 powers give the player so much creative freedom in how they approach the sandbox that I spent almost 2 hours thoroughly exploring the Great Sky Island and experimenting with them alone, just for the fun of it, before I finally got around to doing the 3rd shrine and getting the next power. The 3rd power I unlocked was Ascend, which gives Link the ability to vertically phase through just about any solid flat surface above him, and has a surprising number of applications beyond the obvious traversal. With the 3 shrines completed, we can return to the Temple of Time to meet with Rauru and unlock our 4th and final power for now, Recall, which allows you to move an object backwards in time and, like Stasis before it, freezes time when you activate it. Like Ascend, this power is simple to use but has a number of clever applications for the player to figure out over the course of the game. With all 4 powers in hand and a still empty 5th slot, we prepare to leave the Temple of Time and Great Sky Island, but are stopped by a door that requires more hearts than we have in order to open. King Furrybait sends us to a 4th and final shrine on the Great Sky Island where we receive the final Light of Blessing required to trade for a heart container from the goddess statue. This gives us enough hearts to open the temple door, and a cutscene follows. Link speaks with the ghost of Rauru, who says he did what he could to help Zelda, and then another cutscene shows the Master Sword seemingly being transferred through time and space from Link to Zelda at the temple. After this finishes, we're prompted to dive down to Hyrule below to begin searching for her, and at this point we're about 5 hours in and almost at the point where the game will set us free to explore. Before we leave the Great Sky Island, I'd like to take a short detour and discuss a big part of the game I've glossed over: Zonai devices, capsules, and dispensers. Zonai devices come in a number of different varieties, ranging from single-use battery-powered cooking pots to wings that will glide through the air. Some are passive and interact with the world in a specific way, like said gliding wing, and others are active, requiring that you hit them or the contraption they're attached to in order to turn them on and start draining your battery, like with fans. There's over 2 dozen of these devices, and they can be found all throughout the world. However, the way you collect them on demand is by visiting a dispenser, which will give you a variety of Zonai devices stored in portable single-use capsules that you can take out of your inventory to use almost whenever you want. Different dispensers give out different combinations of Zonai device capsules in exchange for the Zonai cores, which can be looted from dead Zonai constructs or traded for with the friendly steward constructs in the game. It's also important to note that most Zonai dispensers and cores are found in the Sky Islands. With that out of the way, we're ready to dive down to Hyrule proper and start our adventure. Just a short distance down the road from where we land is the appropriately named Lookout Landing, which will be our base of operations in Hyrule. We're welcomed back by none other than the new and improved Pura, who has apparently managed to de-age herself successfully to a hot 20-something-year-old, because of course she has. Anyway, Pura sends us on a short trek north to investigate a sighting of Zelda at the now floating Hyrule Castle, during which we meet with the guard captain before watching Zelda in the distance vanish in a flash of light. Upon returning to Pura, we report our findings, after which she explains the cannon-like structures known as Skyview Towers, super clever name, right, that also happen to replace our Sheikah Towers as the arbitrary fill-in-the-map side objective in every open world. These ones, however, are different in that they at least launch you up into the Sky Zone amongst the Sky Islands, as well as doing the traditional area scan from Breath of the Wild. With these unlocked, we're finally set free upon the world of Hyrule, but not without being given some ideas of where to go and what to explore. Pura first tells us of 4 regional phenomena in roughly the 4 corners of Hyrule that have cropped up in the aftermath of Hyrule Castle being torn out of the ground. Whatever they are, they're wreaking havoc for the locals and may be related to finding the missing princess. With some vague but not particularly pressing objectives in mind, I set off to explore in hopes of finding what I had missed in my first attempts to play through Breath of the Wild, that grand sense of adventure and immersive open-world exploration which made so many people fall in love with it. I spent nearly 20 hours thoroughly exploring each and everything that caught my eye as I first decided on, and then slowly made my way towards the first of 4 so-called phenomena. I have to say that these opening 20+ hours were honestly pretty incredible. Like I've said too many times already, we'll get to exploration and combat etc. later, but there's no denying that I was consistently impressed by what I experienced. It felt like the devs were constantly showing me signs that many of my personal complaints with Breath of the Wild, as well as many of the more commonly accepted flaws that have been recognized in the year since its release, were being addressed and possibly fixed or removed in this sequel. Continuing on with my adventure, bear with me, we're almost to the end of this section. I made a couple of short trips into the depths before deciding to explore it more thoroughly when I had more supplies. I should point out though that one of the primary reasons for making this choice was the mistake alluded to earlier. In one of my first visits to the depths, I stumbled upon an armored Lynel. Not being one to turn away the chance at a real challenge, I decided to fight it, but quickly realized that my entire arsenal of consumable weapons and supplies was unlikely to break the armor and cut through its health. Unfortunately, not knowing what to expect from this dark and seemingly dangerous place, I incorrectly assumed there were armored Lynels crawling all over the depths and resigned myself to returning when I had better equipment. This didn't end up happening for almost 20 hours, which those who have already played the game will know means I went a significant amount of time without some important tools and information. Had the game provided me with even the weakest version of some unbreakable weapon, I would have committed myself to beating the Lynel because that's just how I play games. I won't harp on about this point, but it certainly damaged my experience with the game at the time. Moving on, I sought out and visited any Sky Islands I could reach with the nearby Skyview Towers, as I quickly realized they were the primary place for finding and gathering different Zonai components I could play around with. I completed any and all shrines I came across, as I desperately wanted to increase my stamina via the Lights of Blessing, and I also met with Impa and began seeking out the Dragon's Tears at her recommendation, which are this game's way of gathering memories or story cutscenes. I also did a number of other side quests as I made my way towards the first chosen regional phenomena, and the one which the game and multiple NPCs implied was intended to be the first, the cold front passing through Rito Village. Now I know many people will say, but there is no intended order. However, I'd argue that given each of the 4 areas are of vastly different difficulties if you visit them immediately at the start of the game, this is simply untrue. I don't remember if this was quite the same for Breath of the Wild, but that game heavily pushed you towards Kakariko Village and the nearby Zoro's Domain. For example, in this game, the enemies in Zoro's Domain will be dramatically more dangerous and spongy versions than those you'll see around Rito Village if you go to both before you've reached whatever milestone it is that makes enemies scale up. With that in mind, I believe the intended order of objectives goes Rito, Zora, Goron, Gerudo. I think Goron and Zora are the most interchangeable, as they're both appropriate for the mid-game, but I firmly believe Rito is meant to be the first and Gerudo is meant to be the last, as it's the most challenging and has the darkest vibe. Anyway, pressing on, I eventually made it to Rito Village, where I met a young Rito and son of the Rito chief, Tulin. Tulin did not make a good first impression.
That's not fair at all!
I hate this fucking bird, and I mean no offense to his voice actor, but every word he spoke was like daggers in my ears. He's just the most obnoxious and basic interpretation of a child character I've seen in games lately. If I was a kid, I'd be offended that this is Nintendo's idea of a child. But that's all just a silly personal nitpick, so I'll let it go for now. Back to the quest at hand. So long story short, this little shit stain of a bird runs off and tries to figure out what's causing the regional problem before anyone can stop him, and we have to go after him. Once we catch up to the stupid bird, we help him get his bow back because he's managed to get it stolen like a dumbass. And after helping him, Flying Fuckstick here agrees to help follow Link around and work together to reach the large flying ship that seems responsible for the extreme weather. He also gives us the ability to create gusts of wind whenever we want, which is admittedly pretty helpful, and they propel our glider forward and interact with the world and objects in a manner similar to creating a gust of wind with a Korok leaf. Upon reaching the boat, we're greeted by a mysterious voice who asks us to find and power 5 devices that will unlock the gate to what is obviously the boss room. This ship represents the first of 4 temples that have taken the place of Breath of the Wild's divine beasts. I promise this is the last time I'll be saying it in this section, but we'll get to my feelings on the temples later. I quickly push through the dungeon, solving small traversal puzzles and dispatching basic enemies. After opening the 5 locks on the main door with Tulin's wind gusts, the mysterious voice returns and introduces himself as the Rito Sage, an important representative of the Rito in ancient times and an ally of King Raru's. He asks us to cleanse the temple of the corruption being spread by our first boss, Kolgara. Kolgara has a great design, being a giant flying ice centipede, and while the fight looked nice, it was incredibly straightforward and easy, utilizing the glider, Tulin, and the new dive mechanic to pass through the open rings on its body. After defeating the boss, a cutscene plays featuring Tulin, Link, and the Rito Sage, in which the Sage passes their power and responsibility onto Tulin, and we're given permanent access to a spirit-looking version of him that will fight alongside us and allow us to use the wind gust ability. Him being Tulin, that is. We then return to Rito Village to report on our success and continue the adventure. Okay, that was a lot, so thanks for bearing with me as that is the end of my not-so-little abridged recap covering the first fourth to third of my playthrough. The reason for detailing my journey up to this point is twofold. One, by the time I had finished writing the Great Sky Island section, it became clear that to cover my entire journey sequentially from start to finish would not only be incredibly time-consuming, it'd ultimately drag out an already long video. And 2, much of my praise and criticism can be expressed by comparing and contrasting this condensed part of the game with the rest of my journey. Before we move forward, I'd like to take a moment to talk about my feelings towards the game in those first 30 to 40 hours. I was undeniably and pleasantly surprised by just how much fun I was having with Tears of the Kingdom, and while nitpicks and concerns arose throughout, they did not meaningfully impact my enjoyment of the game most of the time. That began to change as I approached and then soared past the 50-hour mark. I have plenty more good to say about the game, and I hope you'll keep in mind that my overall feelings towards it are positive, no matter how hard that may be to believe given what I've said in the opening. So rather than talk about the good and then the bad or vice versa in any particular order each time, I'll be discussing what I consider to be the major elements of the game and break down how I think each one succeeds and fails where relevant. So without further ado, let's finally dive into my thoughts, feelings, and opinions on Tears of the Kingdom, starting with the presentation and performance. Before I say anything, I want to reiterate that these are just my opinions because for this first section I will be tackling the bad first. I say that because despite believing most people would agree the performance isn't great, I'm well aware that I feel more strongly about this than most. So let's get to it. The performance in this game is awful. Like it's really, really bad. So bad in fact, that were it not hypocritical of me to do so as someone who overall enjoyed the game, I would call it completely unacceptable and downright disgraceful. Don't get me wrong, there are some moments in Tears of the Kingdom that absolutely blow my mind in terms of technical achievement and visual splendor. I'll go into this more when we get to the section covering exploration, but the fact that without any scripted transition or visible loading, Link can dive from a sky island straight down to Hyrule and then even further down through a chasm all the way to the depths in a single uninterrupted sequence is legitimately incredible. The devs honestly worked magic to make a game of this size and scale even run on the 7-year-old smart toaster that is the Nintendo Switch hardware. But that simply doesn't excuse the fact that in 2023, this game that will obviously be a Game of the Year contender can be released running at a sub-HD resolution and a very unstable 30 FPS. And when I say unstable, I mean unstable. The frame rate in the game constantly drops into the low 20s and below. This can be caused by the environment, like with the dense foliage or weather, too many enemies or just assets in general moving at once, almost any interaction that results in more than one enemy entering ragdoll state, too many particle effects on screen, and worst of all, the frame rate 5. For now, all you need to know is that as you progress through the main story, you'll collect 4 more allied NPCs similar to Tulin, that fucking bird that follows you around, and they allow you to use a variety of abilities when interacted with. The best part is that they clearly take as much or just slightly less processing power to render than any other NPC, and so when you start to have more than 3 of them out at a time as you progress through the game, the FPS drops constantly as they move through the world with you, and especially when they interact with enemies. On the bright side, the art direction goes a long way here, and I mean no disrespect to the devs who are forced to make their game run on such dated hardware, but we've reached a point where this isn't just a little bit behind the times or slightly less than ideal. This is a brand new $70 video game that runs at a standard that would be considered unacceptable from literally any other first-party developer, and rightfully so. As I've said before, I'm not trying to shit on a game people love because it's got supposedly minor technical issues. I simply believe that if we as consumers and fans of video games actually want our games to look and run better, then maybe we shouldn't call games with technical performance well below the rather relaxed industry standard a masterpiece just because the fun outweighs or otherwise shines through the inexcusably bad performance. Now, in spite of all that, Tears of the Kingdom was rather stable on a basic level if you exclude its frame rate, resolution, and occasional hitching on the way into the depths. I don't remember it ever crashing, deleting save data, or any other major game-breaking bugs. In fact, the physics system in general seems to be more bug-free in my experience than it was in Breath of the Wild, so points to the devs for that, especially considering the many additional interactions with the physics system generated by our new abilities. Anyway, I think I've made my point about this game's performance, so let's move on to something I have plenty of praise for, the art style and overall presentation of the game. The very first thing that caught my attention was the choice of colors used in the opening and throughout the Sky Islands. The golden leaves contrast the blues of the water and sky and complement the gray and white of the stone of the islands in ways that are so striking and eye-catching, it made me like the color yellow despite years of insisting it's definitely the worst. Against the blue skies and golden leaves, it only makes sense that the accent color running through the whole game and replacing the electric blue energy of the Sheikah is a beautiful shade of jade green representative of the Zonai. I'm not well versed in art and don't really understand the details of things like color and contrast as much as I'd like, but suffice it to say, I found the entire color palette of the Sky Islands to be mesmerizingly beautiful, and if I had anything resembling a complaint, it'd be that I wish there were more Sky Islands and more time spent on them, if only to spend more time surrounded by these colors. The surface of Hyrule is less impressive, as it's obviously very similar to its previous iteration in Breath of the Wild. However, I found the environmental changes to overall add to the presentation, and it's still beautiful in its own right. There are still plenty of rolling green hills and beautiful forests, but overall it felt like there was more variety in elevation and fewer uninterrupted vistas, which I think actually helps make the world feel a little larger while making the regions feel more distinct. And then we get to the depths, which is more of a mixed bag. While I love the low visibility and overall foreboding atmosphere, it definitely feels very one note, aside from the one part of the map of lava. I don't think that's a mistake, just a choice I don't personally vibe with. As with the other sections, I'll cover the depths more when I get to exploration, but for now I'll say that in spite of the lackluster presentation, this was one of my favorite parts of the game to explore, and the darkness was very effective at making everything feel larger and more confusing than it already was, in a good way. While I'll wait to cover the content in the context of the cutscenes until we get to the story section, I will say that overall they were decently animated, didn't have any noticeable performance issues, and I enjoyed what little voice acting there was. Speaking of voice acting, let's move on to sound design. While I didn't mention it when talking about Breath of the Wild, I think Tears of the Kingdom is a similarly mixed bag as far as sound design, though certainly an improvement. As an aside, this is something that you may notice myself and my script wrestling with consistently throughout the video. So much of Tears of the Kingdom is an undeniable improvement on Breath of the Wild, but improvements rarely felt focused on the areas of greatest need, and when they aren't substantial enough. To get a major complaint out of the way quickly, the almost complete lack of voice acting outside of the scripted cutscenes is much like their performance, absolutely unacceptable. And if you're going to go in the comments and tell me it was a valid stylistic choice, respectfully, fuck off. They give the major characters and even some minor characters voices for cutscenes, and for some reason even paid their voice actors to say single words or make weird grunts of acknowledgement when interacted with.
Check it!
But I guess they draw the line at actually having voice actors read the poorly written text boxes that take the place of what would be dialogue in most games with this kind of development time and budget.
Yes.
They clearly weren't opposed to giving the characters voices, and yet for reasons beyond my ability to comprehend, Almost every character outside of cutscenes just makes stupid noises akin to slamming a dog toy against a wall. Again, this is a AAA video game that costs $70, but I guess Nintendo's just like some small indie company, man, not a multi-billion-dollar behemoth of entertainment. Anyway, moving back to something more positive, but continuing with sound design, I like the gentle music and well-mixed ambient sound effects like footsteps, animal noises, and even the wind and rain. They all come together beautifully to make exploration a blissfully peaceful and relaxing experience. I love the town songs, though I honestly couldn't tell you if they are the same or different from the ones in Breath of the Wild, and appreciate how they change from day to night. However, my one small nitpick with the music would be that sometimes it's too subtle or absent. At times I would have really liked it to punctuate a moment. I felt a number of times, whether exploring somewhere dangerous or taking in a beautiful view, that some nice music to suit the moment would have gone a long way, and was honestly surprised both that it wasn't there and that I noticed. Overall, despite my complaints, I think sound design lends itself to improving the best parts of the game, namely the exploration of the open world. Speaking of which, I think it's time we move on to our next major section and one of the most important.
Oh.
Yes, that was an intentionally misleading segue, but if you noticed, thanks for still paying attention. Before I can talk about exploration, combat, or puzzles, I need to go over the abilities which replace those of the Sheikah Slate in Breath of the Wild. Just to get to the important parts faster, I'll say that both Recall and Ascend do what they say on the tin. One reverses time on an object, and the other allows you to vertically phase through any flat surfaces overhead so long as they're close enough. They both have their fair share of interesting and fun interactions to discover, but they're not as integral to the wider whole of the game as the other three abilities and their relationship with Tears of the Kingdom's version of crafting. But if you want to be impressed, drop an item from a sky island and test just how far away you can target and recall it from. It's pretty cool. Like I said, both abilities have multiple clever uses that aren't apparent at first glance, and I enjoyed the moments when I would discover such uses for them. But now we move on to the most important additions to this Breath of the Wild sequel, Ultra Hand and Fusion. Ultra Hand, as I mentioned near the beginning, grabs almost any object in the game with a tether similar to magnesis, but the thing that really makes it special is the ability to magically glue objects in the world together by simply making their edges meet at the angle you want. This is then combined with the Zonai devices, which are essentially a wide variety of mechanical parts that can be joined to each other and other objects in the world with Ultra Hand. If you were on Twitter at all around the release of Tears of the Kingdom, then you certainly saw the wide range of creations that come of this. Everything from big statues with flame-spewing genitalia to fully functional battle mechs have been built using a combination of Ultra Hand, random junk, and ancient battery-powered components from wheels to rockets to laser beams and many more. I, like many others, had an absolute blast with this system. I thoroughly enjoyed taking every opportunity to create some kind of vehicle or overly convoluted contraption to solve simple problems, and it did a lot of the heavy lifting in regards to making the game fun for me. However, this did eventually start to get old as it became clear that once again, the problems to be solved were only one layer deep and could be consistently solved with a handful of the same vehicles and tools. I also found the limitations of the battery system early on and the way certain devices despawn after a certain amount of time active more frustrating than it had any right to be. It made sense from a game balancing standpoint, but given their complete disregard for this in every other part of the game, it felt pointless nonetheless. The only upside to the battery system is that the upgrades to your battery are some of the only meaningful upgrades to be found in the game. I know that's a strong statement, but I plan to back it up throughout the rest of the video. Now let's move on to Fusion, the other half of Tears of the Kingdom's crafting system. With Fusion, just about any movable object in the game can be attached directly to your weapon or shield, including and especially many of the Zonai devices. Enemies also drop new items, generally horns or claws that are good for attaching to weapons and arrows. These make up the majority of damage increasing components that can be fused to make or strengthen weapons. Any throwable item can be fused to your arrows while holding the bow, thereby allowing for the creation of different elemental and utility arrows. I'll talk more about the variety and strength of these various options when I get to combat, but for now it's enough to know that Fusion, Ultra Hand, and to a lesser extent cooking, are how Tears of the Kingdom facilitates its own particular version of crafting. While I don't believe they truly capture the feeling of slower, more traditional crafting systems, their intuitive design, ease of use, and near universal applications within the game itself make for a wholly unique crafting experience that I really enjoyed engaging with for the first half or so of the game. My largest complaint with the crafting system would be how much of the game is centered around it, and how, as I mentioned above, it dramatically dismantles what little challenge may have otherwise been in the game. To put it simply, it's incredibly overpowered even at the most basic level. In most, if not all cases, crafting offers the simplest, easiest, and most efficient way to solve any problem. For any distance you need to travel, whether vertically or horizontally, the correct answer is almost always to build a vehicle. Fusing together a weapon with increased stealth attack damage and throwing puff shrooms can trivialize virtually every encounter with regular enemies, and bomb flowers either thrown or fused to arrows can do the same for bosses and mini-bosses. Even in shrines where they've intentionally locked you out of using Zonai capsules, a rocket-fused shield can subvert almost any traversal challenge. And those are just a handful of examples using basic ideas that, once again, are only one layer deep. Hell, with Zonai devices and Ultra Hand, players have assembled death machines that can basically delete any enemy in the game with little to no effort. What I'm ultimately getting at is that the ways in which they've restricted crafting only serve to frustrate, like with battery life and device timers, when compared against all the ways they've clearly chosen to forgo any attempts at balancing the game or provide meaningful challenges, like with combat and puzzle design. I do see how the building can for some people be an entire game unto itself, and I have no doubt there are people who will spend countless hours simply building strange contraptions and vehicles of all manner just for their own amusement. But I'm the kind of player who needs a meaningful objective to complete, a challenge to overcome, or a goal on the horizon. I very rarely enjoy messing around in games just for shits and giggles, and when I do, it's short-lived and shared with friends. The only way I can think to describe it is that Tears of the Kingdom offers a suffocating and detrimental amount of freedom to do whatever the fuck you want. How can freedom be suffocating and detrimental? Let me give you an example. If you walk into a room with a puzzle that has 5 obvious and equally correct solutions laid out in front of you, would you really consider picking one of those solutions to be as satisfying as being told there's one solution and that you have to figure it out for yourself? If your answer is yes, then please see yourself out. For the rest of you with critical thinking skills, you obviously know the correct answer to be no. Now, I'm mostly kidding, as the real answer is it depends on the person, but I think I've made my point. For those who do enjoy the freedom and creativity on offer, Tears of the Kingdom crafting offers an incredible range of choices to make and fun ideas to try. But for those who enjoy meaningful challenges, the tension they create, and the satisfaction of overcoming them, this game has very little to offer outside of, holy shit, that worked, and what joy you personally derive from the intrinsic rewards of exploration. Speaking of which, now I think it's about time we move on to our next, and mostly more positive section, exploration and the open world. Exploration, like the art direction, is an element of Tears of the Kingdom I have very few complaints about, and since this section will be mostly positive, I'd like to get my biggest complaints out of the way so we can talk about the good stuff. Starting with the biggest and only substantial failure of Tears of the Kingdom's open world exploration, its inability to provide the player with meaningful extrinsic rewards. The open world and the design of exploration aren't exclusively to blame for this, but nonetheless, there are very few if any reasons to explore other than for the joy found therein. You will certainly be rewarded, from crafting materials of all kinds to various weapons, armor, and collectibles. It's just that virtually none of these rewards ever have a meaningful or substantial impact on the overall gameplay experience, the only exceptions being Zonai devices to play with and Blessings of Light for stamina. With that out of the way, I think it's time we take a break from all the negativity and give some much-deserved praise. The act of simply heading out in any one direction and investigating anything and everything that catches your attention is something truly special. I can think of few games that offer the level of genuine immersion and sense of exploration that simply traveling the world of Hyrule, the Sky Islands, and the depths collectively combine to give. I think I've made it pretty clear whether I want to or not that I'm a very objective-driven player, and yet Tears of the Kingdom is one of the only games that has pulled me away from that mindset and successfully made me take in the beauty and wonder of its world just for that reason. It's exactly what I failed to find in Breath of the Wild and what I desperately hoped I would get to experience in this game. This sense of wonder and the true joy of exploring for the sake of exploring and simply asking, what is that? Let's go see. It's really incredible and is the reason I can confidently say I love my time with this game in spite of all my complaints and strong opinions about what I believe to be its failures. This is no doubt substantially improved by the simple but ridiculous fun of flying through the sky, whether on a basic fan-powered glider or more silly but still functional options. While this might make the world of Hyrule itself feel smaller, the great distances between the Sky Islands, along with the depths being basically an entire extra Hyrule that is slower and more resource-intensive to explore, all completely mitigate any damage the ease of traversal may have caused to the scale of this open world. Speaking of the depths, I spent a good majority of the second half of my playthrough exploring and lighting them up and enjoyed a lot of it. While it didn't have much in the way of visual appeal, the atmosphere, management of light, and pressure applied to your resources by both the darkness and gloom help create an interesting gameplay loop akin to a survival game. While in Hyrule and in the Sky Islands, I would gather things like bright blooms and sundelions for dealing with the threats posed by the environment of the depths. While in the depths, I would gather bomb flowers, puff shrooms, and muddle buds, which are some of the strongest combat resources in the game. When I ran out of resources either in the depths or above ground, I would simply make the trek back up or back down and continue exploring until I had an adequate amount of supplies. This worked very well and was such a seamless gameplay loop that I suspect it's exactly what the developers intended, so props to them for that. I have to give them credit for leading me into it in a way that let me feel like I had discovered it naturally without the need for signposting. Speaking of signposting, I don't consider this a fault of the devs or a failure of the game, but as I alluded to earlier, I managed to sidestep and avoid doing the quest that leads you to your final ability, Auto Build, and the revolution that more Zonite forges are spread throughout in the depths for over 30 hours. Now, Auto Build's not that important in the grand scheme of things, like it matters, but it didn't make a huge difference to my playthrough after I found it. However, I know I'm not the only one who did that, as a number of my friends and viewers also missed it until much later in the game. I think it's just a failure to realize that the quest is a main quest and not a side activity, despite it being clearly listed as a main quest in the journal. Like I said, I don't think this is the developer's fault at all, but I do find it funny that this happened to multiple people despite Nintendo's ever-present obsession with holding the player's hand at every turn. Speaking of hand-holding, let's talk about the one other part of the open world I have serious complaints with, though you may disagree about whether or not they're part of the open world: the shrines. Shrines and shrine puzzles in Tears of the Kingdom were something I found enjoyable early, if for no other reason than they broke up the exploration and other tasks in a way that felt natural and helped pace the overall game. I also found the focus on Zonai devices and on using the new abilities substantially added to my early game enjoyment of the shrines, because these are simply some of the most fun puzzle tools an adventure game has ever given to the player. However, I have three major issues with shrines: the order in which the player discovers them, the reward for completing them, and the simplicity of the puzzles within them. Just like in Breath of the Wild, you're given the 4 main abilities and a corresponding puzzle to solve them with before leaving the tutorial area on the Great Sky Island. And just like in Breath of the Wild, there are multiple shrines in different directions and distances from your starting place in Hyrule that continue to be used as very basic tutorials. And I'm not talking about the ones which are clearly meant to be the introduction to specific Zonai devices or combinations. There are 3 separate shrines just to demonstrate the basic mechanics of the bow: headshots, arrow time, and fusing items with arrows. Let me repeat. There are 3 separate shrines for these very simple mechanics. They're all related to a core part of gameplay, that being the bow, and could easily be condensed into a single shrine. This is nothing short of tedious, and these aren't the only shrines dedicated to tutorializing the game's core mechanics. And don't get the wrong idea, I have no issue with there being tutorials for the 2 returning bow mechanics and 1 new one. I know that many people of all ages will play this without having played the first, and regardless, tutorials are just an essential part of making games accessible. My problem is that these and other core mechanics should have been condensed into a single shrine per relevant mechanic, and should have been spread around the Great Sky Island as either mandatory shrines akin to the first 4, or as optional shrines that appear after the first 4 for those who want to spend a little more time on the Great Sky Island itself. These shrines perplex me because the devs clearly value accessibility and tutorialization of mechanics, but then stuck the main tutorials for legitimately important mechanics in random shrines. This not only obfuscates them from players who need them most, it puts them in the path of more experienced players who expect to have left the Great Sky Island with knowledge of all the game's core mechanics and are ready to explore in earnest. Moving on to my issues with the difficulty or lack thereof to be found within shrine puzzles and combat trials, this was already a major issue with Breath of the Wild, and while I admit these shrines on the whole are slightly more interesting and often have at least one more step, they're still fundamentally devoid of any challenge. Am I going to take the time to give examples and prove that? Nope. This extends to the temples. While these are also much better than their predecessors, the Divine Beasts, the vast majority of puzzles are simple to the point of being tedious time wasters and only broken up by the occasional, lol, they actually let me do that moment. I understand that those moments are one of the best things about Tears of the Kingdom, but they come few and far between, especially as you get further into the game and discover consistent and efficient ways of solving your problems. I also won't bother to expand on the temples because they really are just a handful of themed shrine puzzles revolving around the relevant sage's special ability. Throw in some basic enemies and an easy or tedious boss at the end for good measure, and you've got yourself a temple. Yes, the sage's powers have relevant utilities outside of their respective temples, but other than Tulin speeding up gliding, they make little difference to the game. Returning to the issue of shrine difficulty, I think Joseph Anderson suggested a good solution to this problem that would subsequently solve the problem of discovering tutorial shrines later in the game, or difficult shrines early on in his now 6-year-old Breath of the Wild critique. Yes, we're going back to the same video. He makes a lot of good points.
By that I mean, Nintendo could have made a set list of shrines from 5 to 120 and dynamically changed which shrine you load into depending on how many you've done before that. By doing it this way, there could have been a real actualized difficulty curve with shrines expanding on concepts from previous shrines because the developers knew that players already had a chance to see them.
However, like he says, I'm not a brilliant game dev at Nintendo, and I'm sure they could come up with an equal or better solution to this problem. My final issue with the shrines are, as I mentioned earlier, with regards to exploration, the rewards. You can find chests like any other out in the open world, generally containing equipment, gems, or rupees, and as I've said, none of these things are likely to hold much value to the player. And at the end of every shrine, you're rewarded with a Blessing of Light, which, as I mentioned near the beginning, again, is the replacement for the Spirit Orbs in Breath of the Wild, and serve the exact same function. Give 4 to a goddess statue to increase either your health or stamina. Now, increasing stamina is great, however you can't increase it past a rather conservative 3 wheels, and while I know some younger or more inexperienced players will benefit from the cart containers, as I'll talk about in the combat section coming up shortly, I've never found a single compelling reason to get more than the bare minimum of hearts. Not until the game forced me to get more in order to open a special door as part of the main story quest, just like the one at the beginning of the game. What this means is that as soon as I had gotten the necessary number of blessings to max out Link's stamina gauge, I had virtually no extrinsic reason to visit the shrines and wasn't going to continue rolling the dice on whether or not I might stumble into an interesting puzzle, because chances are I wasn't going to. Before I had reached the halfway point of my playthrough, shrines had basically become nothing more than glorified fast travel points. I would say I was disappointed, but honestly I was just glad the early ones were more fun with our new abilities. And Nintendo set the bar so incredibly low the first time around that it would have been hard to disappoint me anyway. Now, as I mentioned briefly in my thoughts on Breath of the Wild, the combat in that game was ultimately gutted of any meaningful challenge by the overwhelming strength of Flurry Rush and the way healing is done through the pause menu. Well, I'm sad to say that basically nothing about this has changed. The one exception being that enemies with a certain undefined level above Link can one-shot you, which was previously only possible in Master Mode. It's a welcome change as it provided some of the only challenging combat encounters I had, yes, even while playing most of the game with very few or no additional hearts. Speaking of enemies, enemy variety in this game is as much a joke as it was in Breath of the Wild and only slightly improved. There's a handful of basic ground enemies worth little mention, 3 new mini-boss types, and I believe only 1 normal-sized flying enemy, but because it dies in 1 hit, it's just a big keese. Oh, and any Guardian-related enemies are now completely gone, along with, to my knowledge, any and all other references to the Sheikah Slate or other Sheikah tech such as the Divine Beasts, other than some helmets themed after them. I was gonna write a whole section on this or include it in the story, but it's really just that simple. They don't mention it. Now, some enemies do have armor that must be broken off by a variety of different methods before hitting that part of their body will inflict damage. Does this sound interesting? Because I thought so too until I realized, like most improvements to Breath of the Wild's formula, it's just 1 layer deep. Sometimes, some enemies have armor so you can't slash or stab them without just bouncing off. And it doesn't really get more complicated than that. If you're using a blunt weapon, this means nothing to you. If you're using explosives, this means nothing to you. And if there are 2 things Tears of the Kingdom has in spades, it's blunt objects and explosives, which means that on the whole, this probably means nothing to you. Okay, so enemies aren't really much stronger, but what about Link? I can't say it any other way. I think the devs wanted him to be an unstoppable god, because that's what it feels like. Now, Flurry Rush, as it has always been, is an easy and consistent way of making any of the quote-unquote tough enemies in these games an absolute joke. We can take this a step further in Tears of the Kingdom because the very overpowered but somewhat rare bomb arrows from Breath of the Wild have been replaced with a craftable version. This, however, is made with the widely available and easy to amass bomb flower which can be fused to your regular arrows. But wait, there's more. Where Flurry Rush trivialized 1v1 and boss encounters, now they've introduced new tools for trivializing any challenge created by being faced with multiple enemies. These come in the form of 2 silly little plants, the Muddlebud and the Puff Shroom. The Muddlebud makes any enemy hit by it attack anything nearby. As far as I could tell, this has no restrictions, so simply fire it at the biggest monster in a group and watch it wreak havoc while keeping the attention off you. Likewise, the Puff Shroom affects basically all enemies in the game, creating a smokescreen that blinds enemies and allowing for easy stealth strikes. But that's not all. Enemies hit with a stealth strike while in a Puff Shroom cloud will let you repeatedly stealth strike them again for as long as the cloud is up. So by using any weapon made with an 8-fold blade, which are very easy to come by and give a bonus to stealth strike damage, plus a couple of Puff Shrooms, there is not a single combination of regular enemies that can pose any threat to Link. Just to drive this point home, I used puff shrooms on the final enemy gauntlet before the final boss fight of the game, and yeah, as you can see, it's a joke. It's been playing in the background this entire time. And that's honestly all I have to say about combat. I could compliment the ability to do goofy shit in combat for the sake of it, as was possible in Breath of the Wild, but I think for most people that kind of gameplay wears thin after a certain age, unless you're entertaining other people with it. It's really just not very good, and for fuck's sake, there's still not a dedicated dodge button outside of the buggy lock-on system, so that's great. Really shows the value 6 years of development time and iteration has on a bad combat model, Nintendo. So with combat having been broken down more than the weapon system, I have a final section left to go through, the story. But like what story? Nah, I'm kidding, this isn't Breath of the Wild. Anyway, the short version is that when Zelda fell into the abyss at the beginning of the game, she was sent back to the time of Hyrule's first king and queen, Rauru, and Zelda's ancestor, Sonia. Throughout the different memories we receive at each of the hieroglyphs painted across the land, it is revealed to us that Zelda arrived shortly before Ganondorf began his rebellion against King Rauru. We see him try and fail to launch an assault with a bunch of Molduga, only to be thwarted by Rauru's furry-empowered Kamehameha wave. He then makes an obviously fake pledge of loyalty as penance before masquerading as Zelda to attack Queen Sonia and steal her sacred stone.
Wow.
The knife was in front, so he didn't have it.
Did he just punch her real good?
Yeah, I think he just punched her so hard she
He just shot her.
Oh yeah, and each of the main characters and sages has their own Infinity Stone. So anyway, Ganon steals Sonia's Infinity Stone, uses it to become the Demon King, and then Rauru, Zelda, and the 5 sages fail to defeat him, at which point Rauru sacrifices himself to imprison Ganondorf. Before going any further, let's catch up with the events that happen in Link's time. Having covered the first regional phenomena, I can now finally reach the payoff of that by saying for Link's story, he does the exact same thing 3 more times. Meeting with the different sages, cleansing their temple, and watching them pass on their title to the accompanying companion who agrees to help Link when the time comes. We then seek out the final sage in the depths, except this sage is Mineru, Rauru's sister. Oh, and she's still alive. Kinda. She preserved her spirit using the power of her spirit-themed Infinity Stone, and once we assemble the parts, she becomes a super cool but completely useless Zonai mech which Link can ride around on. Upon meeting Mineru proper, she explains the events of the past to Link and reveals how he is to defeat Ganondorf. So now let's cut back to Zelda's timeline, picking up after the sages were defeated and Ganondorf imprisoned. Knowing imprisonment won't be a permanent solution, Zelda comes up with a plan to stop him in the future. In one scene, we find out that the Master Sword can be restored and even greatly empowered with light energy given enough time, and in another scene, Zelda is told by Mineru that anyone who swallows their Infinity Stone will be transformed into an immortal but mindless dragon devoid of all memories. So naturally, Zelda realizes that if she becomes a dragon and carries the sword with her until Ganondorf awakens in the present, it may be long enough to restore and empower the Master Sword to the point that it can defeat him once and for all. And so that's exactly what she does. At this point, we see her swallow the Infinity Stone, turn into a dragon, and then to my disappointment, scatter the dragon's tears and memories across the land all at once. I was honestly impressed Nintendo was willing to make such tragic implications about Zelda's future and sacrifice, but I felt that would have hit even harder if it was shown that she cried out the tears over centuries, forgetting who she was slowly rather than all at once. Following this, it's also clear that Zelda, having been in the past the whole time, is not who people have been spotting around Hyrule causing problems. Rather, it's Ganondorf disguising himself as her, the same way he did when attacking Sonia. So Link goes to Hyrule Castle, taunted by Ganondorf, and eventually being told to face him in the depths with the Master Sword, which Link obviously does. Ganon sends a few waves of monsters at him, and upon their defeat, we enter a multi-stage boss fight with Ganon himself. Unfortunately, this fight is just a copy and paste of all the different Shadow Ganon mini-bosses found throughout the world, of which I'd already fought and killed a handful of. However, in the final phase, Ganondorf swallows his Infinity Stone out of desperation, and Zelda as the Light Dragon comes to our aid, and we have a final battle with Dragon Ganondorf from atop Zelda's head. While none of it is challenging, the final fight is quite the spectacle, and definitely wins points from me by the rule of cool alone. Upon defeating Ganon, a cutscene plays where the spirits of Sonia and Rauru use presumably what is left of their power to transform Zelda back to normal and leave her free falling through the sky. In one final act of heroism, Link dives headfirst after Zelda, catching her in the air and holding her close as the two of them plunge into a body of water. And for the most part, that's the story of Tears of the Kingdom. To be honest, I really liked it for the most part. However, my experience of the story was largely broken down and otherwise damaged by the fact that memories and their corresponding cutscenes can be found and experienced in any order. Because of this, I found the memory about swallowing an infinity stone and how it will turn you into an immortal dragon early on in my playthrough, and learned of how to restore the Master Sword not much after. With those two scenes spoiled early on, and also having gotten the Master Sword quite early, I was easily able to piece together Zelda's entire plan to transform into a dragon and recharge the Master Sword rather quickly. It's honestly a decent twist, one I wish I had experienced firsthand in a compelling story told in order. I overall think the story is a step up from Breath of the Wild in that it actually exists, and the twist will probably be a decent one for most people. Didn't expect a ton of story content or have any faith in Nintendo to tell a good story, so I was pleasantly surprised in small ways, despite the broken order in which I ultimately experienced this one. As I said in my opening, I believe Tears of the Kingdom to be a game of great highs and great lows. The exploration, art direction, world design, new abilities, and Zonai devices all come together to create a wide variety of thoroughly enjoyable experiences. And yet the performance, combat, storytelling, shrines, temples, and complete lack of any meaningful challenge come together to create equally tedious, uninspired, and eye-rolling moments throughout what could have been an unwaveringly special experience. Were it only more focused on creating well-earned moments and objectives that felt worthwhile to complete with all the wonderful and ridiculous tools it gives you, Tears of the Kingdom could have been actually worthy of its impending Game of the Year nomination. Coming back to my point about the depth of improvements, let's go through them. Weapon durability is improved but not fixed by fusion. Combat is improved but not fixed by the inclusion of new enemy types and armored variants. Shrines are generally more than the one-off rooms of Breath of the Wild, but they're not any more challenging or respectful of the player. The story is actually relevant and rather interesting this time around, but still told in a poorly considered non-linear fashion. The temples are a big step up from the Divine Beasts, but still present trivial encounters, easy puzzles, and cool-looking but unimaginative bosses. The ending is also substantially better, but still rather anticlimactic. While the final fight with Demon King Ganon is better than the Calamity Ganon fight in Breath of the Wild, it's still piss-baby easy and undermines any sense of tension the game was trying to build. Perhaps some of these issues will be addressed in future DLC, but if Breath of the Wild is any indicator, then I'd assume not. If you were to ask me to describe a game like this one as honestly and as succinctly as possible, all I'd have to say is that The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is truly a beautiful mess. One thing I'd like to address before I close this video out is a point I touched on in the critique but think deserves a little more attention and perhaps even its own video one day. And that's the difference between intrinsically and extrinsically motivated players. I think the vast majority of us are at least a little bit of both, but I have no doubt that some people heavily favor one form of motivation and rewards over the other. For example, I am very intrinsically motivated, but my intrinsic motivation is largely derived from the satisfaction of overcoming substantial difficulty and developer-imposed challenges. In the absence of those things, I become far more intrinsically motivated and engage for the sake of meaningful or exciting rewards that many games condition us to want. I think the reason a game like Tears of the Kingdom will remain so divisive in the years to come is because the type of player you are can have a rather substantial impact on your experience, which is what I was alluding to when discussing all the possibilities found in the crafting system. I have no doubt that people who enjoy simply testing the limits of these systems for their own entertainment and creative expression will have a much better time with this game than I did, and I would never tell them they're wrong for engaging with the game that way. But I made the decision that for this critique and any others going forward that I have to ultimately speak for myself and the experience I had, even when I can see the merit to be found in other people's. So with that final bit out of the way, I'd like to thank you for watching if you've made it this far. This is my first ever properly scripted and edited YouTube video and first ever game critique. I hope this is the first of many more to come, so please share any and all feedback or constructive criticism so that I can make the next one even better. If you like the video and want to see more, like, subscribe, and ring the little bell to stay up to date with progress on my videos in the channel. I also stream variety gaming full-time on Twitch, Monday through Friday, 12 PM to 5 PM Pacific Standard Time, so if you'd like to stop by and chat about any and all things video games, or just get a sneak peek at some of the games I'm planning videos for, come say hi. Before I go, I just need to give credit to the people who made this video possible. So first and foremost, I have to thank with all of my heart my wonderful fiancée Maya. I have loved video games my whole life. They are and always have been my greatest passion. And yet, were it not for the unflinching support of this amazing woman and her unwavering faith in me, I never would have had the confidence to start streaming or taken this chance to share my love and passion for games with others. So thank you, my love. If only a few people ever see this, I'll still be proud of myself for having tried, and I owe all of that to you. I'd also like to extend a colossal thank you to my friends Lemon, Silk, and Ink for their support and all they've taught me in the short time we've known each other. I've never expected to make friends when I started streaming, and I certainly didn't expect to make some of the greatest friends I've ever had the privilege to know. I am already a substantially happier person and better human being for simply having known you three, and regardless of where the stream or this channel goes, know that I love you guys and hope to be your friend and laugh with you for many years to come. To everyone else who has supported me, namely stream regulars like Fox, Ligonius, Funny Guy, Viovi, Rave, Tam, and anyone else I might have missed, thank you so much for all the kind things you've said and done in support of me and my passion. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but even the thought that I might get to make a career out of my favorite thing in the world brings tears to my eyes. The fact that any of you even show up for, much less contribute to that dream, man, all I can say is thank you. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to shout out and give thanks to the many content creators who first inspired me to pursue it all those years ago. Namely Joseph Anderson, Chris Davis, Never Knows Best, Monty Xander, White Light, and I Finished a Video Game. So to each and every one of you who has helped me get this far and made all of this possible, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Until next time, that's all folks, and thanks for watching.